When can we say that we know a word? As you know, when I started Link, I was convinced, and I'm still convinced, that the best indication of your potential in a language is the number of words you know. However, there are languages that I have learned at Link which show that I have this enormous vocabulary, 40,000, 50,000, 80,000 words, and yet I know right now I would not be able to produce those words. I may even have trouble understanding those words if I see them in a given context. Should I go back in and adjust my statistics to reflect where I am today? I don't think so. Obviously, when we say we know a word, it can mean that we are able to use it. It can mean that we only understand the word in a specific context. It may mean that we have a limited sense of the scope of that word and how to use it and what word it's used with, or we have a more complete sense of the scope of that word. When I have tutored people in English, I've often sensed that people have more trouble with sort of which words are used with which words. In other words, that better sense of the scope of the word as opposed to grammar, for example. So understanding and broadening our scope of understanding of a word is extremely important. And the total number of words, which usually reflects that we've read a lot and listened a lot, that we've been exposed to a lot in the language, that normally also indicates that we have a better sense of the scope of meaning of those words. But my approach is, when we say that we know a word, I still rely on my statistics at Link, especially if I'm engaged with the language. To me, it's a motivator. It's an indicator of where I am potentially, but I recognize that I have to constantly revive those languages if I haven't, been using them for a while. And there is a difference between memory and retrieval. And in that regard, the article that I read recently from Harvard online, and one of those articles, when I looked up the whole issue of memory, which indicates that if we're not using something that we put into memory, it could be a person's name, it could be a word in language learning, and if we don't use it, then the brain has a tendency to sort of file that away so that we may find it more difficult to retrieve that, because there's so much other information that the brain needs to make readily available, because we're trying to anticipate what's going to happen in our lives or even in a language. And so if we're not active in a particular language, it's very possible that we'll have more trouble retrieving this information that our brains have filed away for us. And so this article refers to sort of what they call FOUR, F-O-U-R, a mnemonic, to help us, think about how we can improve our ability to retrieve bits of information, or in the case of words, our ability to retrieve words. So it starts with F. Focus. So every time I review a word, obviously when I first come across a word at Link, I look it up. I now have the meaning in my database. Doesn't mean I know the word, but it's now status 1. When I see it again, I may move it along, and there are certain functions in Link that move it along in status to 2 or 3, lighter and lighter hues of yellow, and eventually we can move that to known, or automatically it moves to known. But on many occasions, I move words, the status of words, back from known to unknown, because I thought I knew it in a particular context, and then all of a sudden I don't know what it means. Or I will deliberately move it back to status 2 because I want to see it more often, together with other words, together with other phrases, or maybe I want to hear it again in the text-to-speech, just to kind of help me get to grasp the pronunciation a little bit better. There could be a number of reasons why I move it back and forth, and I don't worry about the impact of that on my known words total. The known words total is simply an indication of the extent to which I have been active. So focus is one. The second one is organization. So obviously, all of the words that I save are put into my database at Link. That's how I deal with it. I used to make lists by hand and then look them up in the dictionary, but I don't do that anymore. It's in my database. I can relate it to other words and phrases. To my mind, it's parked there. I can move a word to known. I can move it back to unknown. If I move to another language, that is still parked in my database. I can go back there and retrieve it. That's how I organize it. So that's the O word. U is understanding. So understanding is extremely important. It helps us to remember. I think it would be very difficult to remember a word that we don't understand the meaning of. And so when I'm reading, even if I have a word that's fairly well understood, if I'm not entirely sure what the meaning is, I look it up. So I'm always looking to improve and deepen my understanding of a word, and that's one of the reasons why I move it to known and then move it back to unknown again, because again, I remind myself, no, in fact, you don't really know that word. So that's all in terms of knowing a word passively. I don't worry about how many words I can use actively. In other words, that I can actually use in speech or in writing. I just feel that those will come along. When I'm in that situation where I need them, I will be able to retrieve some. I will be unable to retrieve some. It doesn't matter. As long as I continue increasing my understanding of words and the number of words that I understand and the relationship of those words with other words, I'll eventually be able to use more and more of them. And that brings us to the fourth point in FOUR, which is relating the words to other things. The more we can relate things to other words, to phrases, to structure of the language, to even a story that we heard, all of that is going to help us to retrieve that word. It's going to tie that to us in an emotional or in a stronger way. And that's why very often the variety of contexts in which we encounter words is going to be, in many cases, more important than the frequency with which we meet these words in order to help us understand and then to be able to retrieve that word. So when can we say we know a word? Can I claim to know 50,000 words of Korean? No. That's an indication and a reminder to me when I go back to Korean, as I've done recently, that I've actually put a lot of effort into Korean. And actually, I find that I know quite a lot of words on the page, but I have trouble speaking. How do I retrieve more when speaking? Speak more. So I'm not sort of saying I know all these words in order to show off. But to me, if that word is on my page as a white word, at some level, once I knew that word. If I now come across the word and I don't know it, I just move it back to unknown. I move it to status 2 or status 3. It doesn't matter to me. What I'm trying to say is, objectively to say, I know so many words is not that meaningful, other than as a general indicator of your potential and level in the language, and an indicator of how much effort you have put into learning the language. And the more effort you have put into the language in listening and reading and speaking, the better you're going to be in the language. So it's kind of like a leading indicator of your level in the language, but it may not be the level you are at right now. And that's how I use the known word total at LINC, and that's what I think we can say about how many words we know. As I always say, the key thing in language learning is to motivate yourself and have a positive attitude. And so to not worry about words you can't produce, and yet take credit for the effort you have put into acquiring words as counted by LINC. That should be a source of satisfaction, hopefully encouraging you to continue acquiring more words and then using them whenever you get the opportunity without worrying about what you can't retrieve. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.